Robert E. Lee was a Virginia gentleman and a brilliant military commander who became one of the most complex figures in American history. Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, was born at Stratford Hall in Westmoreland County, Virginia on January 19, 1807. He came from one of the most distinguished families in America. He had an aristocratic bearing. Lee's family lineage was extraordinary. He was the son of Revolutionary War hero Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. When Robert was just 6 years old, his father abandoned the family, leaving them in financial ruin. The young Lee helped care for his invalid mother. He learned discipline, responsibility, and duty at an early age. In 1825, at age 18, Robert E. Lee entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. He excelled there, graduating second in his class in 1829. Remarkably, Lee completed his 4 years at West Point without receiving a single demerit. He was a model cadet who embodied the ideals of honor and discipline that would define his entire career. After graduation, Lee was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. He spent the next 17 years building fortifications and improving harbors along the Atlantic coast. In 1831, Lee married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. They settled at Arlington House, the Custis family estate overlooking the Potomac River, and Washington, D.C. The couple would have 7 children. Together, Lee was devoted to his family, though his military career often kept him away from home for long periods. Mary Custis Lee brought enormous wealth and social standing to the marriage. Through her, the Lee family maintained their connection to George Washington's legacy. Arlington House was filled with Washington family heirlooms and memorabilia. In 1846, when the Mexican-American War began, Lee finally saw combat. He served under General Winfield Scott in the campaign to capture Mexico City. Lee distinguished himself through his exceptional reconnaissance work and tactical brilliance. He would ride out alone or with a small party to scout enemy positions, often at great personal risk. His reports were so detailed and accurate that they gave American commanders a decisive advantage. General Scott called Lee the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. Lee was wounded at the Battle of Chapultepec, but he refused to leave his post. He was promoted multiple times for gallantry and meritorious service. The Mexican War established Lee's reputation as one of the finest officers in the United States Army. After the war, Lee returned to engineering duties. He served as superintendent of West Point from 1852 to 1855, where he worked to improve the academy's curriculum and standards. Lee then accepted a position as lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Cavalry stationed in Texas. The assignment took him far from his family, but Lee believed it was his duty to serve wherever the Army needed him. He spent years on the Texas frontier dealing with hostile Indian tribes and the harsh conditions of the borderlands. Lee was a strict disciplinarian, but his men respected him for his fairness and his willingness to share their hardships. He led from the front and never asked his soldiers to do anything he would not do himself. In October 1859, Lee was called to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where the abolitionist John Brown had seized the federal arsenal. Lee commanded the detachment of Marines that stormed the engine house where Brown and his followers had barricaded themselves. Lee's force quickly overwhelmed the raiders and captured Brown. The incident at Harper's Ferry revealed the deepening crisis over slavery that was tearing the nation apart. Lee personally opposed slavery, calling it a moral and political evil, but he believed it would end gradually through God's will rather than through violent upheaval. Lee owned few slaves himself, but through his wife's inheritance he controlled the enslaved people of the Custis estate. He was required by his father-in-law's will to emancipate them within 5 years. As tensions between North and South escalated, Lee watched with growing concern. The possibility of disunion filled him with dread. Lee loved the United States Army. He had served it faithfully for more than 30 years. He believed deeply in the Union and the Constitution, but Lee's loyalty to Virginia ran even deeper. In the culture of his time and place, a man's first allegiance was to his state. Virginia was not just where Lee lived, it was who he was. His identity, his honor, his family's honor were all bound up with Virginia. When the secession crisis came, Lee faced an agonizing choice between his country and his state. In April 1861, after the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for troops to suppress the rebellion. Virginia had not yet seceded, and Lee was offered command of the Union Army. Francis Preston Blair, acting on Lincoln's behalf, met with Lee at his home in Arlington. Blair offered Lee command of the forces that would be raised to put down the Southern rebellion. Lee agonized over the decision. He spent the night pacing and praying. He opposed secession and he opposed war, but when Virginia voted to leave the Union on April 17, 1861, Lee made his choice. He could not raise his hand against his native state, his family, his home. Within days, Lee resigned his commission in the United States Army. It was the most painful decision of his life. Lee wrote that he had to follow his conscience even if it meant sacrificing everything he had worked for. Lee traveled to Richmond where he accepted command of Virginia's military forces. He was soon commissioned as a general in the Confederate Army. Lee spent the first year of the war in various assignments, including an unsuccessful campaign in Western Virginia that damaged his reputation. But in June 1862, when General Joseph Johnston was wounded, Lee was given command of the army defending Richmond. He renamed it the Army of Northern Virginia, and it would become the most famous Confederate force of the war. Under Lee's leadership, the Army of Northern Virginia won victory after victory despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Lee's first major campaign was the 7 Days Battles in June and July 1862, where he drove Union General George McClellan's army away from Richmond. Lee was aggressive, almost recklessly so. He was willing to take enormous risks to achieve victory. He divided his forces in the face of superior numbers. He attacked when conventional wisdom said he should defend. Lee's audacity kept his opponents off balance. In August 1862, Lee won a stunning victory at 2nd Manassas, routing another Union army. Then Lee made a fateful decision. He would invade the North. Lee believed that a Confederate victory on Union soil might convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy. It might also strengthen Northern peace Democrats and weaken support for the war. Lee led his army across the Potomac River into Maryland, but the invasion ended in disaster at Antietam on September 17, 1862. In the bloodiest single day of the war, Lee's army fought McClellan's forces to a standstill. Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. Antietam was a strategic defeat for the Confederacy. It ended any hope of European recognition, and it gave President Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But Lee had escaped destruction and his army remained intact and dangerous. In December 1862, Lee won his most one-sided victory at Fredericksburg, where Confederate forces slaughtered Union troops attacking across open ground. Lee watched the carnage and reportedly said, "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it." In May 1863, Lee achieved his greatest tactical triumph at Chancellorsville, where he defeated a Union army twice the size of his own. Lee divided his forces, sending Stonewall Jackson on a daring flank march that routed the Union right wing, but victory came at a terrible price. Jackson was mortally wounded by friendly fire and died days later. Lee said, "I have lost my right arm." Jackson's death was a blow from which Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia never fully recovered. Emboldened by victory, Lee launched a second invasion of the North. In June 1863, he led his army into Pennsylvania, hoping to win a decisive victory that would force the North to negotiate peace. The campaign ended at Gettysburg in the first 3 days of July 1863 in the largest battle ever fought in North America. Lee attacked Union forces commanded by General George Meade on July 3. Lee ordered a massive frontal assault across open ground against the center of the Union line. Pickett's charge, as it became known, was a catastrophic failure. Confederate forces were cut down by artillery and rifle fire. Lee lost a third of his army at Gettysburg. He took full responsibility for the defeat, telling his men, "It is all my fault." Lee offered his resignation to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, but Davis refused to accept it. After Gettysburg, the war became a grinding struggle of attrition. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was given command of all Union armies. Grant understood that the North's advantages in manpower and resources would eventually wear down the Confederacy. He launched a relentless campaign against Lee's army, attacking again and again. Even when he suffered terrible casualties, Grant said he would fight it out on this line if it took all summer. The Overland Campaign from May to June 1864 produced some of the war's bloodiest fighting at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor. Lee's tactical skill allowed him to inflict heavy losses on Grant's forces, but unlike previous Union commanders, Grant would not retreat after a defeat. He kept moving south, forcing Lee to give ground. By June 1864, Grant had pinned Lee's army at Petersburg south of Richmond. The two armies settled into siege warfare with elaborate trench systems stretching for miles. Lee's forces were slowly starving. His supply lines were cut one by one. His army was shrinking through casualties, desertion, and disease. Lee knew the Confederacy was dying, but he continued to fight. He believed it was his duty to resist as long as possible. He hoped that Northern war weariness might still lead to a negotiated peace that would preserve some form of Southern independence. In early 1865, with the Confederacy collapsing, Lee was given overall command of all Confederate armies, but it was far too late. Lee's army was trapped at Petersburg, starving and outnumbered. On April 2, 1865, Grant's forces broke through the Confederate lines. Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. He led his army west, hoping to resupply and continue the fight, but Union forces pursued and cut off his escape routes. Lee's army was surrounded, hungry, exhausted, and reduced to fewer than 30,000 men. On April 9, 1865 Lee met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse to discuss surrender. Lee wore his finest uniform with a jeweled sword. Grant wore a mud-spattered private's coat. The two generals who had fought each other for nearly a year treated each other with respect and courtesy. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home. They could keep their horses for spring plowing. Officers could keep their sidearms. Lee accepted the terms. When Lee rode back to his men, they crowded around him. Many were weeping. Lee told them, "I have done the best I could for you. Go home now, and if you make as good citizens as you have soldiers, you will do well, and I shall always be proud of you." After the war, Lee faced an uncertain future. He was a paroled prisoner without citizenship or property. Arlington House had been confiscated by the federal government and turned into a military cemetery that would become Arlington National Cemetery. Lee was indicted for treason, though he was never brought to trial. Lee applied for a pardon and the restoration of his citizenship, but his application was misplaced and he never received a response. During his lifetime, Lee accepted the presidency of Washington College, a small struggling school in Lexington, Virginia. He devoted the last 5 years of his life to education. As president of Washington College, Lee transformed the institution. He expanded the curriculum, adding programs in engineering, journalism, and commerce. He emphasized practical education that would help young Southern men rebuild their region. Lee was a hands-on administrator who knew every student by name. He stressed character and honor, telling students, "We have but one rule here, and it is that every student be a gentleman." Lee's presence attracted students and donations. The school grew and prospered. Under his leadership, after his death, it was renamed Washington and Lee University in his honor. Lee discouraged bitterness and calls for continued resistance. He urged Southerners to accept defeat and become loyal citizens of the United States. He believed the South's best hope lay in reconciliation and rebuilding. Lee largely stayed out of politics, but his mere existence as a symbol of the lost cause gave comfort to former Confederates. He opposed giving African Americans the right to vote, saying they were not ready for political equality. Lee's views on race remained those of his time and place. He accepted emancipation as a fact, but he did not embrace racial equality. In the years after the war, Lee became an icon of the lost cause mythology that romanticized the Confederacy and its fight. Lee himself contributed to this by rarely speaking about the war and never writing his memoirs. His silence allowed others to shape his legacy. Lee suffered from heart disease, likely brought on by the stress of the war years. In September 1870, his health declined rapidly. On October 12, 1870, Robert E. Lee died at his home in Lexington, Virginia. He was 63 years old. His last words were reported to be, "Strike the tent." Lee's funeral drew thousands of mourners. He was buried beneath the chapel at Washington and Lee University. Lee left behind a complicated legacy. He was undeniably one of the greatest tactical commanders in American military history. His victories against superior forces demonstrated his brilliance as a battlefield leader, but Lee fought to preserve a nation founded on slavery and dedicated to white supremacy. His military genius prolonged a war that killed hundreds of thousands, and his choice to fight for the Confederacy made him a traitor to the United States in the eyes of many. For generations after his death, Lee was venerated throughout the South and respected in the North as an honorable warrior who fought for his beliefs. Monuments to Lee were erected across the country. He was held up as a model of duty, honor, and nobility, but in recent decades, Lee's reputation has been reassessed. Many now see him not as a tragic hero but as a defender of slavery and oppression. The monuments erected in his honor have become subjects of intense controversy, with many removed or relocated. The debate over Lee's legacy reflects America's ongoing struggle to come to terms with the Civil War and its meaning. Robert E. Lee remains one of the most written about figures in American history. Biographers continue to examine his life, seeking to understand the man behind the legend. Lee was deeply religious, devoted to duty and honor, yet he fought to preserve an evil institution. He was personally courteous and kind, yet he commanded armies that killed hundreds of thousands. He opposed secession, yet he led the rebellion. He loved the Union, yet he tried to destroy it. These contradictions make Lee endlessly fascinating and deeply troubling. Lee's military campaigns are still studied at war colleges around the world. His tactics at Chancellorsville and Second Manassas are considered masterpieces of the military art, but his strategic decisions, particularly his invasions of the North, are criticized as reckless gambles that hastened Confederate defeat. Lee's aggressive style won spectacular victories, but it also caused casualties the Confederacy could not afford. Some historians argue that a more defensive strategy might have prolonged the war and increased the chances of Southern independence. Others contend that only Lee's brilliance kept the Confederacy alive as long as it did. In the end, Robert E. Lee was a man of his time and place, shaped by the culture of the antebellum South with its codes of honor and its racial hierarchies. He made choices that seemed right to him based on his understanding of duty and loyalty, but those choices had catastrophic consequences for his country and for millions of enslaved people. Lee's life raises profound questions about honor and duty, about loyalty and treason, about how we should remember those who fought for causes we now recognize as wrong. These questions have no easy answers, but they must be confronted if we are to understand our history and ourselves. Robert E. Lee was a military genius and a Virginia gentleman who became the face of a rebellion that nearly destroyed the United States of America.